please talk about the relationship between either death and love or death and truth?
It may be that I'm all talked out after tonight's class, but you know, when I first met Hussein, I think the first maybe year or two, I think my relationship with him was relatively casual. I mean, the ideas were interesting. I can't remember that far back. But at a certain point, maybe a year after or so, something happened. You know, you begin to have such an intimate relationship with these ideas. And it wasn't even Hussein. I think he just represented something. And all of us were attracted to what he embodied. And it was fun. It was exciting. It was meaningful. But all of a sudden, I think all of us got this, I think, sense that we're looking for an experience or we're looking for something and it's not there, it's not available. The books talk about it. You pray, you fast. And I remember the only book I would read over and over again was Tazkiratul Awliya, the lives of the great Sufi teachers. And in that book, these folks were doing such extraordinary things, and you wanted to do what they were doing. But none of them, and none of the things that you would do would satisfy you. And I'm not really quite sure why. You were just looking for something and there was no nourishment besides Hussein. And the problem with, I think, those ideas at the time was that there is nothing in life that can give you comfort. And you look around you, everybody's going somewhere and everybody's doing something, and you're just stuck. And you're stuck and there seems to be no future for you, and your body becomes irrelevant. All the things that, is around you and has to offer, you don't pursue them because you can't relate to them anymore. And you lose so much as a result of just focusing on these ideas. But these ideas don't bear any fruits, and you just sit there for a long, long time. And then you begin to ask, if your life is worth it, if it's worth continuing. Your parents can't reach you, your friends can't reach you. And sometimes I would remember going to Hussein, but I couldn't verbalize my language. My question, I wasn't sure what I was asking. All I knew is that there was such a great amount of pain, and the sense of homelessness inside me that I didn't know how to put that into language and give it to Hussein. And even if I did, I'm sure he would just say, just be patient. And whatever relationship you had with anyone, with the exception of Hussein, they were all just demolished. And you feel alone, and you feel sad. You have a past, but you've left it. And I think sadness and sorrow and depression and loneliness just get you stuck in the present, in the sense that everything is so dark and you can't see any light ahead of you. And so at a certain point you say to yourself, maybe I should just end it. There is nothing to do, nowhere to go. And I think by the time you get entangled with these ideas, you're intensely consumed. You can call it love. but you don't really know what to do with it. And the pressure on you is so much, and you feel heavy all the time. And things wouldn't get any better even if you went to Hussein, but Hussein had his attention towards like Mehrdad or the other Hussein. It would make you feel worse. And sometimes he would ask like, Amir, how are you doing? It's such a silly question to ask. You know, this kid comes to you and his life is relatively intact. 6 months later, everything is destroyed. And then you ask him how you're doing. But this other step was never taken. The step was actually making death a reality of sorts. Like your physical death. When you fall in love or you fall in love with these ideas, and ideas are like up in the air, you have no idea what they are really. And you don't really know how to bring them down and make them applicable to your life. You're just a novice at this stage. I suppose the other way you can look at the concept of death is that just emotionally, you can't connect yourself to anything, you can't relate to anything. And if you can't relate to anything, there are no passions to be had, no pleasures to be had, no thing to be pursued. I think what saved myself, not so much Mehrdad. Mehrdad was married with kids, and Qasim, Saeed. We just started playing music. And every week we would get together. We would have some food, we would chit-chat for a few minutes, and then we'd start playing. And it was pretty sad music, I think. And most of it really had to do with the fact that you had a few older folks, a few younger folks, and they were all confused and restless and homesick. And music became a way for them to vent a little. That really saved us and our friendships. Sana'i, who is another famous Persian Sufi poet, he has this line, عاشق مشوید اگر توانید, that if you can, do not fall in love. If you have ears that hear, tell your ears the following, do not fall in love. عاشق مشوید اگر توانید تا در غم عاشقی نمانید. Do not fall in love if you can, so that love's sorrow doesn't poison you. You know, all of you have jobs, some of you have families, some of you are growing families. There is so much that all of you have to look forward to. But when you're 18 and there is no anchor in your life, and all you have is some ideas, and they smell really, really good, but you just can't taste them. They're just so far away. And, you know, the experiences that they give you once in a while, whether you have, you know, a dream or some other sorts of experience, their lifespan is very, very, very short. And after a while, you don't even care for them. You stop writing down your dreams or even sharing some of the other experiences. You just find them irrelevant because they haven't saved you in the past and they're not going to save you. At least that's how it was for me. So eventually even the most inspiring moments became insignificant. It's good that you guys are friends. And once in a while you get in touch. And it's good that you read books and listen to audios. They're good reminders. But I think love and death, Stacy, are siblings. The moment you begin to love something or someone, you begin to lose interest in almost everything. And when you feel as if the object of your affection is rejecting you or has rejected you, you just don't have anything. You know, you question why you go to work. You question why you talk to anybody, why you have a relationship to anything. But these are just temporary. Such storms usually pass. It's good to buy a house because it could be like a companion. You know, you paint one room, then you decorate another room, then you fix the front, fix the back. Once in a while, invite people, clean the house, feed people. It's a good thing. You've written Daughter of Fire. There was so much anguish and dread in this woman. Many times throughout the book she would ask why she's even alive, if it's worth it. We just don't know how it happens. How all of a sudden you just wake up one morning and you just find yourself consumed by the various emotions love creates. Or you just wake up and you find yourself in love with whatever. There is nothing rational about it. And despite, all the storm and devastation, there is something quite beautiful about it. It's we don't have the capacity to stay with it for too long. It's too much. So our organism just shuts down for a little bit to recover. And it's good if you have a relatively busy life, because then you can escape. You can use your life as an excuse to get out for a few minutes, a few hours, a few days. That's all I have. Sorry, Stacey. I remember sometimes you would ask questions from Hussein. There is so much frustration inside you. And you want him to respond to you in a way where he can just put out the fire. But it doesn't work. And I remember Merdal and I, because we were both so young, not so much Hussein. Sometimes the tone of our voice would change. Be more combative, more assertive. And I suppose you could say a bit disrespectful. And in so many words, you would tell him that your answer was really bad because I'm so angry. I'm so frustrated. That despite the fact that what you said makes a lot of sense, reason and making sense out of things is irrelevant at this point. It's like the story of Moses and the shepherd by Rumi. Moses is rational, the shepherd is just in love. Moses is a man of faith, but the shepherd has a different set of qualities. And once Moses contaminates the shepherd with rationality, and then Moses receives a message from God that what you've done was wrong, he goes to apologize to the shepherd and to tell him that, he can love, and he can express that love in any way he wants to, but the shepherd looks at Moses and says, "You've broken me. I don't know how to get myself back." All of us have a Moses, our rationality. And that at some point comes down and says, this is ridiculous and stupid. Just go back to your life and go back to the things that you know and do things that make sense, which is good in many ways. Abhi, you have anything? You don't have to, I'm just asking. Can't see anything.
You said something in class maybe Monday. I think. I think you were talking about the teacher-student relationship, and you said something about how, you know, good teachers or real teachers are always in disguise, and they're waiting for a worthy student, and that if or when a worthy student appears, I think you said something like, something in the teacher is pulled out. And I think you talked a lot about sort of like what that is like from the perspective of the student sort of meeting a teacher, but I wonder what that experience is like for the teacher. For a teacher, what happens when or if a teacher meets a worthy student or a potentially worthy student.
You know, I would bike from Roseville to Sacramento to Hussein's shop. And he would be with customers, he would laugh, he would be in the back, putting things in the freezer, organizing his shop. Just like what people do, you know. And then he would come and sit. You know, I would sit by the register, by the window, while he was doing work, and sometimes I would ask while sitting by myself, you know, I rode all the way from Roseville to Sacramento just to sit by myself. I could have done that at the car wash or at the house. Because, you know, you're a kid, you don't understand things, and you're very self-involved because you're in so much pain. It's just about you. And I think unconsciously, because you knew that Hussein was a culprit, he was the one who did this to you, you should also in some ways, you know, pause doing things for the business and just come and sit next to you and talk to you. But, you know, that's how he made his living, so he was busy. And then he would come and sit. And then he would say, okay, what next? Digechi, what next? And then you would ask a question. But he was no longer distracted by the shop. Everything was done. And then you would ask him a question or an interpretation of a poem, and you would want him to give a commentary. And then all of a sudden something about him would change. You know, there would be no one at the shop. And even if someone was to come by, you know, to buy a thing or two, he would continue the conversation. And he wouldn't even look at the customer. He would just say, it's like $10, you know. And he was so short with the customer that, you know how the Persians are. You know, you say hello, and by the time you say goodbye, it's like an hour has passed. And so I guess the answer to your question, I would put it in this way. I think different parts of life pull out different parts of you. And then you remember that you're tired of being exploited by life and your interests are elsewhere. And despite the sink being filled with dirty dishes and the house being unkept, you kind of just sit on the sofa and you open a book, you know, some book on Gurdjieff or something, and you begin to read it. Because you miss this other part of you, and you don't want to give what little energy you have, time you have, to just keep washing dishes and to keep figuring out, you know, what school your daughter needs to go, what camp she needs to go. You know, there was a movie with, I think his name is Jaden Smith, Will Smith's son, and Jackie Chan playing Karate Kid, a different version of it. Jackie Chan had lost his wife and I think children in a car accident, and so he would get drunk. And that kid was being bullied by the small community he belonged to. And one day Jackie Chan comes and rescues him. And this kid asks Jackie to teach him martial arts, and he says no. And it's, you know, what's interesting about the movie when I think of it now is you have a guy who's really proficient. He's sacrificed a lot of his time and energy perfecting this particular craft, you know. But then something in life happens and you realize martial arts is not going to bring your wife back, it's not going to bring your kids back. And perhaps you say, instead of being at the gym, you know, 5-6 hours a day, I should have spent more time with the family. And so there's a good amount of guilt. So every time you want to practice martial arts, you realize that it was because of, you know, this particular thing that you were involved with that you missed out on your family. So he never practiced, just got drunk. And Jaden kept asking him, teach me. I know you know martial arts, teach me. And there came this breaking point where something about Jackie Chan opened up and said, you know, maybe I should stop drinking and maybe I should help this kid. And that's what they did. I think there are two people in this equation. Someone needs to run into a teacher to become a student. And someone who has something on the inside, you know, they need a student for that teacher within to come out. You know, it's like you're an artist and maybe you need to be exposed to some of the images from the Middle East where people have been bombed and they've been massacred, and that inspires you to grab your pen, write a poem, or to do a sketch or a painting of sorts. You know, it's funny when I look at the kids, because I joke around a lot. They don't take me seriously. And in many ways, it's a good thing because the burden is now on Sarah to take care of, some of their issues. And I think I am the way I am with them because they're just kids. They don't have the language, they don't have the experience. There is nothing useful about them when it comes to the areas of my own interest. And so I have no choice but to kind of devolve and go to their level for an hour or two. And it's a conversation that I have with Sarah sometimes, or just with myself, that are the kids ever going to get to a place where they become interested in the things I am interested in? I remember Shahram Nazari had come up with this music album, Yadigar Dost, Remembering a Friend. The couplets by Rumi. It's a beautiful hour music. And I went to Hussein's shop and he said, "So Amir, have you learned or practiced any new music or song?" I said, yeah. He said, "Okay, sing it for me, just don't go so high because, there is this pizza shop next door." I said, "Okay." And I sang the song, but he was just staring into the sky. And when I was done, he looks at me and says, "Do you know what I was doing?" I said, "No." So I was hoping that one day you come here and you'd be interested in the things that I am interested in. Then your song is good, your voice is good, but it doesn't have a foundation. It doesn't have understanding. It doesn't have sacrifice. Even though you sing it well and you have a nice voice, none of those things are interesting for me unless you allow me to build this foundation for you. And I guess in essence what he was telling me is that, Amir, you're useless and you can only be useful if I'm able to kind of create this foundation in you, and then your music can rest on this foundation. Maybe he was just in a funny mood, that he wanted to talk to me about something serious, but I wasn't a serious student of these ideas. I was a serious student of music. And so his interest had to be pushed down. He couldn't bring it out because he didn't see me being that interested. So students need teachers. In other words, someone needs to run into someone, and all of a sudden they find themselves for the first time being a student. And for teachers to express whatever it is that they teach, they need a student, And sometimes you don't really need another human being to be your student so you can come out. I think these days, if you're able to write, this blank sheet of paper or your desktop, it's just waiting. It's like any good student. It's submit, surrender, it's just completely blank. And that's what happens when you fall in love with someone. You may have all these emotions, all these things you want to talk about, but the moment you're there, it's like you're empty, you have nothing. And so, you turn on your computer and it's just a blank screen. Whatever you want to write, I'll listen. And that's what would happen with Hussein. We would go there and anything he would say, we would just receive. You know, it's a funny thing being in the classroom and when students ask questions. When you genuinely and sincerely ask a question from someone, there is something about you, and it's unspoken, and for the most part, the person is unaware of it. It's a confession of sorts that I don't know, and I don't know how to know, and I can't know. All I know is I come here, I look at you, I ask my question in hopes of getting something. But for them to be asking questions, you know, they have to see something in the person standing in front of them. And then the person standing in front of the classroom also goes through a transformation. You know, so sometimes people begin to talk about like silly things in the class and ask silly questions. And in some ways it's a frustrating few minutes because you have to tolerate the silliness. Nothing good comes out of you. You know, you just shake your head and you take a deep breath and you say, really, are you guys serious? And then another raises their hand and asks a really, really good question. And then something about you just changes, you know, and it's all because of the question. And it's all because of the space. We had a psychology teacher. She was part-time. This is like way, way back in 2004, 2005. And her office was next door to mine. And one day she comes in and she was asking for something. And she looks at me and she says, what did she say? That how could you be so focused all the time? Something like that, if I'm not mistaken. You know, I would go to campus very, very early in the morning, and I would have people like waiting, and they would come to the office and they would sit and they would like ask questions, and then they would leave and then another would come, and then I would go to class. And in my younger early days, I would be on campus from like 7 or 6 in the morning all the way till 10 at night, you know. And when you keep doing this over and over and over again, something happens to you and something happens to the people around you, you know. Imagine for a moment if I was teaching my classes online. You know, there is no interaction. Nothing that is good about you comes out. And even if it was to come out, you would have to like write them down. The sort of feedback that sometimes people give. But you need that physical presence, you know. I'm not quite sure which book it was of Ouspensky or some other book, where Gurdjieff talks about the same thing, that there are no students without teachers and there are no teachers without students. You know, I think the analogy he made was one hand washes the other. And it's very true. But it's usually the teacher who benefits most from the interaction. I won't say more about it. You know, the student sees in the teacher something. For us, we just saw Hussein as the embodiment of perfection, of wisdom, something profoundly sacred. And so Hussein was a conduit. And so when we went there, sometimes his look, his body language would just change you, you know, in a good way for us. I think when Hussein would see us and we would ask questions, I think he got a chance to see his own creativity, you know, and while he was being creative in thought and speech, it also made us feel certain things, like intensely. And so everybody just benefited in some ways. But either way, Cassie, you need to have a relatively good and healthy life to make sure that, you know, whatever it is that you're looking for and whatever it is you're engaged in, they're not contaminated. You know, and it always makes me think of the other Hussein. So much struggle and strife and sadness in his life that eventually every good thing in his life just disappeared. And he was a great student, and he was a great friend to Hussein, but in the end, you know, even Hussein would say, you know, there isn't much we can do. No one can do anything. Anything?
I thought of the line in Daughter of Fire, the part about love is produced responding to that.
You said honoring, you said?
Or continuing
Oh.
doing anything.
You know, there are these, I think, different stages when, before, I think, so, if I was to go back into my life, I would say the following. Before meeting Hussein, I had lots of friends, and I had lots of passions and things I wanted to do. Then I met Hussein, and gradually I began to have a very intimate relationship with him. And that relationship caused all the things I wanted to do. So everything disappeared, and I was only focused on Hussein, and I was only interested on the things that he was interested. And that's what happens when you kind of fall in love with someone. You begin to adopt all the things that they are interested, and you begin to pursue them. There comes a point where for a man, I think men have a tendency of pursuing their profession. You know, there is this assumption that all of us men do that. I think we understand. I think we understand really, really well. And I want to go away and apply all the things that I assume that I understand. And so you go do philosophy for a number of years. You get your master's and you get your PhD. And then you begin your teaching career. And you know, the classroom is a very intoxicating environment. You lose yourself in it, and you make some grandiose assumptions about yourself and your capabilities, none of which are true. But we do that nevertheless. It makes you feel good, especially when you happen to be somewhat animated and inspiring, and you're able to scream and shout, and your students react to that most often in a positive way. And time needs to pass. For some, 5 years, or some 10 years, some 20 years. And then there comes a point where you kind of slow down a little. And I'm not talking about slowing down because you've gotten old. You become a bit more reflective, and something about you psychologically just slows down and pauses and begins to reflect back. Because when you forget and when you get yourself busy in life, that which had sustained you, let's just call it love, for all those years, it just goes away, because other things are now vying for your attention, and there's nothing wrong with that. Women have a tendency of wanting to get married and wanting to have children, and for women something happens to them, especially when they have children. The nature of their love begins to change. They become protective of not so much ideas anymore, of their former passions or love, but what they have grown, just children, and rightly so. And they can express that love in a very organic, natural way, without the usage of language. Because essentially what love does is it forces you to make sacrifices, and that's what children do. You love them, and so you make sacrifices. If initially it's the teacher that you worship, the teacher is pushed aside, and now it's your children, and then it's your family, and then how to protect them, how to make sure that no harm comes their way. And once in a while, you do think back as you're raising your own kids, and you say, well, I was kind of like this kid of mine. I was raw, unseasoned, uncooked. I was like all over the place, screaming, shouting. And then I ran into this woman or this man, and something about me changed. And it's like a kid who screams because they're hungry, who screams because they have a rash, who screams because they want to be, touched or petted. And you remember that you too, when you were a student, that kind of like us, every time I was going through some issue, I would pick up the phone and call Hussein. Sometimes I would ride my bike there, sometimes I would drive my car there. But I was harassing Hussein all the time, the way kids harass, their parents. And then time passes and life slows down. And then you begin to remember, And then you begin to value your time with the person you were working with in a very, very, very different way. You appreciate it more. I don't know if you can protect it. I think there's a stage where, you're glued to this person. Then there comes a stage where you kind of walk away and you try to figure out your life. You try to kind of find your own voice, and you become distracted and interested in other things. And then there comes a point where you go back to the first stage. Not physically, but you go back, mentally. And you remember all the ways you work with this person. And then your appreciation for it grows. And I think by the time you get there, you have actually found your voice. You have found a relatively good life for yourself. I can't do anything for my father besides going to the car wash. But now at the age of 60, I'm dimly beginning to understand, the sacrifices that he made. And that's like 40 years later. And now he's, 92, 93. But, you're a kid, and you, at a certain point, you say, Dad, Mom, I'm just going to go out there and figure out my life. And despite their warnings, you won't listen. And rightly so, You should just go out there and experiment and explore. And then you just stop walking and you sit and you think and you say, I understand now. Cassie was telling me that we were at Kazim's house, right? Or at some person's house when Hussein came to you and said, if you ever,
Yeah.
what did he say to you?
Something like if you ever find yourself at a stage or on a stage, I forget how he worded it, but remember that it was because of Amir. Is what he
Yeah,
said.
I think he was wrong.
Mm.
Yeah. What he should have said, should you ever get to anywhere good in life, it's because of Hussein. And ultimately that's how I think you protect the good things that other people give you, by making sure they don't go to waste. You begin to like philosophy, then you begin to love philosophy, and then you major in philosophy, and then you teach philosophy, and then you find yourself a husband or a companion who, to some degree enjoys the way you think and feel about life, and knows when to leave you alone so you can just read and think and be sad or be happy. And you also listen to the screams or the whispers of your body that it's time for certain things. And there isn't much else. Alexis?
Something you said at the beginning of tonight made me think about it. In Daughter of Fire, she talks about, forgive me because I will butcher the language, Fana fi Sheikh.
Fana fil Sheikh.
Can you talk about
So if you put some sugar in a cup, and then you pour some water in the cup, and then you stare, after a while the sugar disappears and all you see is the cup, the water. It just happens to be sweet. And so what you have is a sugar having been dissolved in water. That sugar has now become part of the water. Sugar has no identity anymore. Sugar has no longer a history. Sugar is nothing. Sugar is just water now. So every student who walks and sits in the presence of any teacher, they go there with a great amount of history, personality, ambitions, desires, fears, moral codes, all those things. And so the teacher and the student occupy very, very different stages. The teacher understands, whereas the student simply feels. There is no understanding in the student. Once in a while, the student tries to think and understand and express, but a good amount of their past gets involved, a good amount of their imagination and assumptions get involved, a good amount of their moral codes get involved. And so there is this space where the student can't cross and I suppose the basic analogy would be the student must become sugar and the teacher is of course water, and somehow the student needs to go inside the water, i.e. teacher, his world or her world, adopt the moral codes, that there is nothing that needs to be left about the student. The student needs to be all teacher and not themselves at all, at least for a time, until they begin to smell like the teacher. Now what will happen is the student will eventually adopt the teacher's voice and mannerism. And then there comes a point where the student breaks free. It's kind of like, it's a bad example, but Aristotle was Plato's student, I think for 20 years. That's a long, 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 long time. And then he walks away. And then he finds his own voice. And that's the trick. You know, once you dissolve in your teacher, the teacher becomes the foundation of everything about you. You know, and that foundation really has to do with the way you begin to process experiences, the way you begin to perceive the world and experiences, the way you try to define yourself and see yourself and feel yourself. It's all through, you know, the eyes and the feelings and the thoughts or the ideas of the teacher. You're nothing without the teacher. And that's how you dissolve in him or her. And I think once you've been seasoned properly, or once you've been cooked properly, then little by little, I think you begin to see something about yourself, that you still have a good amount of your teacher inside you, but now there is this other voice that's just yours. Now you begin to interpret, now you begin to make commentary in a way that your teacher didn't, you know. Fana means annihilation, means, you know, basically just to be dissolved. And Fana al Shaykh is to some extent Fana al Haq, Fana al Muhammad. They're all the same, you know, that upon submission and surrenderance, there is nothing of you that's left. And now the teacher can basically enter you and begin to kind of move your emotions and your thoughts. And then as time passes, you realize almost everything about you is the creation of your teacher, almost everything. And just as it did for some of us, you know, sometimes people would say, oh, Amir, you're beginning to talk like Hussein, and your mannerism is like Hussein. And in one sense, you'd be embarrassed because you're just a copycat. In a different sense, you're actually quite proud because it's just a guy that you love. Why wouldn't you want to mimic him? And then that's when you walk away, you know. And you try to be like your teacher, but little by little you begin to see some changes about you. It's a window. Where you allow yourself to be consumed by something fully and you won't react. And you submit willingly. And you're able to take chances. I can no longer bring myself to do any of the things I did when I was 20 or 30 or 40. It's not possible. I just don't have the passion or the desire. You know, in some ways, the book Daughter of Fire is quite amazing. Because you're talking about a woman who has a very rich past, and inside her lives all these great ideas, because she was to some extent a theosophist. And somehow, you know, everything about her past went away. She struggled. I mean, she would often say in the book, the personality tries to come up and show its face. You know, it's one thing to be consumed by someone at the age of 20, but at the age of 50, 55, that's a wholly different scenario. You've built a life and you've built a personality. You know, in your 20s, you're still trying to figure yourself out. You know, you're just unfinished in so many ways. And I think that's what, to some extent, midlife crisis does. That you thought that you had it all together, but your life all of a sudden falls apart. Despite, you know, having a family and all. And then life gives you a chance to be open enough to allow someone to enter your life. And for certain passions, they just explode inside you. And all the life that you have built for yourself, they kind of just take a back seat. I mean, it's quite frightening. You know, I mean, it's one thing to talk about these ideas in a very exotic, you know, romantic way, but they're really quite frightening. Hussein's life fell apart. Merda's life. It didn't fall apart on the outside, but, you know, I think emotionally he just became disconnected from his family. Surviving that is very tough unless, you know, you kind of quiet the intrusion of your teacher and you know, you go back to your life, but you also keep a little bit of that world inside you. It's a difficult place to be. It's always good to have a teacher, I think, when you're like single and you don't have much of a life. Once you're in relationships and have a life, it's too much. I had assumed that because I hung out with Hussein and had some ideas in my head, I could be in relationships and make them go smoothly, but none of them did. You know, you think that you're all settled, but you know, Hussein tried many times to find me, to get me married. Then, very unsuccessful, of course, his tries, but when I eventually did get married, some like 50 years later, he would always say, Amir has not changed. Even at the age of like 55, he's still like the 20-year-old Amir. You know, he's just a mess, the way he sings and the way he talks. You know, this encouragement to go into life and just get busy with life. I don't know how well that works. With this other world. We just have to be very political.